Greetings and shalom, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. If you guys are here with me, please consider liking and sharing this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so, hitting that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And that's usually supposed to be Tuesdays and Thursdays, but I am just perpetually awful at everything, so I've yet to actually get this scheduled at set times. As you can see now, we're on a Wednesday, which is neither a Tuesday nor a Thursday. Um, but nonetheless, that's what we're trying to shoot for, and we'll get there eventually. Appreciate you guys who are here. I see Richard Neal is here, in the live chat. Shalom, and thank you very much for being here. Cryptomaria as well. Thank you also for being here. Again, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And consider following us on different social media platforms. I am on Gab, Parler, Minds, Twitter, and Facebook. You can find me with the tag The Synagogue on any of those different websites, whichever ones you happen to use. I personally would recommend that you use some of those alternative social media platforms like Gab and Parler. I do definitely believe in internet free speech, and the best way to take back internet free speech is to use alternative social media platforms that will actually protect your free speech. A lot of times people say, hey, we want to get the government involved somehow, whether by nationalizing a certain website or creating some kind of law that says they're not allowed to curate their content or something like that. And I don't think that is the way that we need to go about this. I think the way we need to go about this is by voting with our dollar, so to speak, even though it doesn't cost anything, and using the competition. It doesn't mean you have to leave your Twitter, your Facebook, or anything like that, but it does mean you should use the equivalents that will protect your freedom of speech, like Gab, which is my personal favorite, or Parler, or Rumble, which is another one I think you guys should definitely get on if you like this show, because if we ever get taken down off of YouTube, Rumble is where Watchdogs will be posted. They're already posted there after the fact, of course, not live. But if you guys are actually interested in watching this show long term, it's possible we could get banned at some point, and so you should definitely consider following us on Rumble there. I see Kevin's Biblical Discussions also in the live chat. Shalom, and thank you very much for being here. Also want to remind you guys, I didn't do this the last couple times, but it's something we've been trying to start. If you have any questions on anything that I do in this show, pertaining to this particular episode or even a random one, go ahead and tag me at the Synagogue News. And at the end of the program, if there is any questions, there's usually not, but at the end of the program, if there is any questions, we will answer as much of them as we can, which again, considering the small numbers, typically tends to be all of them. I've only ever had people ask questions a couple times, but I figure it's an easy way to get not only interactive but also keep myself from being distracted by the live chat. Because if you guys bring up points that I want to address or bring up something that I think I should answer or something like that, I could just answer it at the end. So if you have any questions, do consider tagging me at the Synagogue News with those, and we'll answer them at the end. And what else do we have for? Oh, yeah. If you want to help support me, you can do so either through Patreon, subscription-based service. I don't have tiers, so you can give as much or as little as you like, or through PayPal, which is a one-time payment service. Again, no tiers, so you can give as much or as little as you like. Links to those will be floating here in the live chat shortly. Alrighty, so we have a interesting show planned for you guys today. I got three topics I want to try and get to. Sometimes I can be incredibly long-winded on some of them, so we'll see if we end up getting to all three of them. But before that, of course, I want to go ahead and get to our pre-article discussions. I really need to find a more catchy name for that because that just sounds so ridiculous. But at any rate, just something I wanted to talk about briefly with you guys. It's kind of it's a weird topic, I guess, in a way. I have recently been online, of course, right? We all have online all the time. It's what we do with our lives. And people have been sharing videos of really egregious violence taking place on the part of young kids for the most part. Sometimes they're up to my age in their 20s, but a lot of times they're in their teen years. And it's just very random acts of violence. One of the videos that I saw the other day was a group of teenagers, like 4 or 5 boys and 2 to 3 girls, uh, beating an old man to death with a traffic cone. Very old man, by the way, in his 70s. Um, and just for fun, not like a provoked attack or anything like that, just because they thought it was humorous. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is just to say I want to make it very brief, but I want to ask you guys a question. Do you think that this is something new, or do you think that this is something that the media is just now starting to highlight? Right? Do you think that we have um, a greater level of violence, more gratuitous violence is another way to put it as well, because even if the levels are the same, maybe this violence is less necessary or less explainable, right? Do you believe that we have a greater level of gratuitous violence today than we did 20 years ago? Or do you believe that the media is trying to paint a picture that says something similar? And if so, why? This isn't just sparked because of these videos. My friend John Maddox had an open room yesterday, and this was a topic that ended up coming up between him and another gentleman who calls himself Bubblegun. Um, and it's just an interesting thing, to be honest with you, because I think there's truth on both sides. I think it does seem like, for example, school shootings are far more prominent now, even than they were 5 years ago, and were more prominent then than they were 5 years before. At the same time, though, like if you look at overall kidnapping numbers, I think there was like 751,000 kidnappings annually in the 1980s, and we're hovering around 250,000 now. Now those are two fundamentally different kinds of thing, in the sense of, one is a mass shooting, one is a kidnapping. But it does kind of, I don't know, sparks an interesting question, I guess is my point. What is the truth on that matter? Are we getting more violent? Are we getting more degraded? Are we getting more gratuitous? Or is the media trying to paint a picture of greater violence, greater gratuity in our country? And both of those, I think, have a pretty interesting potential explanation, depending on which one is true, right? If we are getting more violent, then it implies that there's something dangerously wrong with the society, which I think we all kind of already know that anyway. And if we aren't getting more violent, but we're actually having the media portray us as more violent, then I want to know why they are portraying us as more violent. I want to know what's going on there in their little secret circles. But nonetheless, wanted to make that short. Really, not so much a discussion, just asking you guys questions. And let's go ahead and jump into our um, articles here today. We're going to start on a topic that we talk about frequently. That is the topic, of course, of abortion. Um, Joe Biden has recently signed an executive order to try and curb pro-life victories in the courts. And of course he did, right? We all knew that this was coming. He told us that it was coming. Now it has already come. And we're going to read a little bit about what this executive order entails, whether or not it's going to actually make it through the courts. And also, I'm going to give you guys my opinion about whether or not we should actually care. And to be honest, I'll just give you a spoiler. Um, I think no. I think no. I don't think that we should be interested in what the federal government has to say, not just on this issue, but on numerous other issues also. But nonetheless, let me go ahead and get my screen shared for you guys. Um, let's see here. A little bit of a problem. My bad. There we are. All right. Under pressure, Biden issues executive order on abortion. This is from the Washington Post, I believe, originally. No, the New York Times, excuse me, originally. I got it on MSN, but nonetheless, MSN does not actually write their own articles, I'm pretty sure. At any rate, Under pressure to do more to respond to the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, President Biden on Friday issued an executive order that aims to ensure access to abortion medication and emergency contraception while preparing for legal fights to come. All right. The order is vague, excuse me, but the order is vague about how the president hopes to accomplish those goals, leaving the details largely to Xavier Becerra or Becerra, however you say that, his Secretary of Health and Human Services, who has said the administration has no magic bullet that can restore access to abortion. And that is actually, of course, true, right? In the case of Roe v. Wade, what was happening was the court was saying abortion laws are unconstitutional, right? And therefore they were not legally able to be enforced by the states. What the recent ruling in Jackson v. Dobbs said is that indeed abortion laws are constitutional and that Roe v. Wade was spurious in its ruling. There is, in fact, no constitutionally enshrined right to abortion, and each individual state has the right now to make their own laws, pass their own laws as to whether or not you can get an abortion within those borders. Now, there's no way for the executive branch to restore that access without just flagrantly ignoring the process that we currently have set up as far as the judiciary being able to vote on, whether or not these things are constitutional. Now, there's some question as to whether or not the judiciary is supposed to originally have that power, but they have had that power for the last 200 years. So there's really no debate to be had now unless we're going to debate the entire system, which I think is even relatively reasonable. Thomas Jefferson had warned that, the courts could get too powerful if we saw them as the arbiters of what is and is not constitutional. I think we've certainly seen that. But regardless, we would have to overturn much more than just, anything on Jackson v. Dobbs if we were to relook at the way that our court system functioned. As it functions right now, the courts declare whether or not a thing is or is not constitutional, whether or not it is or is not within the confines of the law. They said that abortion laws are within the confines of the law. And without pulling an Andrew Jackson, the whole he's made his ruling, let him enforce it kind of thing. For those of you who don't know, the Supreme Court once had a case placed before them as, as it pertained to the Indian Removal Act, right? Which was an act that Andrew Jackson and co. had passed trying to remove the Indians, specifically the 5 civilized tribes, as they're called, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole from down there in the South. And John Marshall and the Supreme Court said you don't have the constitutional authority to remove them. You don't have the constitutional authority to violate treaty with them. And Andrew Jackson famously said, Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. The point there being that Jackson had an army, Marshall did not, and Jackson was going to do whatever he damn well pleased because he was kind of a tyrant and a dictator and a disgusting person, if I'm being honest with you. It's amazing that he ever made it on the $20 bill. But anyways, without pulling something like that, Biden's hands are relatively tied. Obviously not so tied that he feels he can't do anything. Otherwise, he wouldn't have signed this executive order. But let's continue to get into what exactly that entails. All right. And Mr. Biden's order stops far short of demands from abortion rights advocates who have criticized him for failing to move quickly to take action after the court's decision 2 weeks ago. Now, real quickly, another brief tangent I want to get here is a lot of these abortion rights activists want to flagrantly disregard our system and the way that our laws work in order to preserve their perceived right to abortion, right? They don't really care that the Supreme Court has made their ruling. They don't really care about the fact that the constitutional process has actually been respected here. They don't really care about the fact that the 10th Amendment allows states the right to make their own laws and issues which are not specifically delegated to the federal government. They don't like that. They don't appreciate that. And so when they say, we don't think you've gone long enough or far enough, excuse me, what they're saying is we want to disregard the rule of law, disregard the Constitution in this regard, and force your hand in such a way that we now have legal abortion. And they even want to do this in ways that are not explicitly disregarding the Constitution, but which still try to disregard the rule of law. For example, stacking the court has been something that a lot of people have been suggesting. If they stack the court, well, right now there's allegedly 6 conservative justices. I would argue there's really only 5. But by conservative, what they mean is constitutional originalist. And if you stack the court, then you can, hey, well, we got two new non-constitutional originalist justices. Now all of a sudden there's six liberal justices. What do you know about that? And that obviously would be flagrant disregard for the rule of law. They want to get rid of the filibuster, which the filibuster is basically a law that states you need at least 60 votes for certain bills to pass through. There's particulars about the filibuster that I'm not 100% privy to, but the point of it is you can't just hammer through a bill with 51 votes, right? You need the 60 at least, provided, of course, you have the president signing off on it, and this president absolutely would. They want to abolish that. There's been talk about creating term limits for the justices, so on and so forth. Talks about making Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. states, thus giving greater electoral power to the Democrats. And while that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't sound like it would be important now, it'd be important as far as, elections and stuff like that, because you have extra electoral votes. You also have extra senators and representatives in that case, right? So it would create a lack of necessity for a filibuster, at least potentially. Right now, there's 50 Democrats. If Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. were made into states, then you'd have 54 likely Democrats, because both of those states, well, in the case of D.C., they would absolutely elect two Democratic senators. Washington, D.C. is one of the most liberal areas in the country. In fact, fun fact, ever since electoral votes have been counted in Washington, D.C., Republicans have not won the Electoral College in Washington, D.C. even one time. All times that the presidency has been up for grabs, the city of Washington, D.C. has voted in favor of the Democrats. So clearly that would be two Democratic senators being put forward. Puerto Rico wouldn't be quite as cut and dry. They tend to vote Democrat now, but in a lot of ways, the citizenry of Puerto Rico is actually quite conservative. It's a mixed bag, because they have socialistic tendencies, probably stronger than most other Democrats in the rest of the country, with the exception of places like, California. But they also have very socially conservative views. There's a lot of nationalism in Puerto Rico as well, which is, super anti-government, of course, wanting to establish Puerto Rico as their own state. I digress. The point here is just to say these are all different things people have suggested as a means to get around what the law and what the law process currently is. But returning to the article. Speaking to reporters at the White House before signing the document, Mr. Biden condemned the court's decision as a, quote, terrible, extreme, and I think so totally wrong-headed, end quote, order. The order would help protect some access to reproductive services, he said, but the only real way to protect access was to elect more lawmakers who support them. And that's true for you guys as well. If you want to see the rights of the unborn protected, you need to be active in your local elections. Presidential elections are one thing, but what about your state legislature? What about your mayor? What about your city council? What about your representatives who you're sending to Washington, D.C., your governor, your senator, etc., right? You need to make sure that you are voting in those elections also, because that's the only way you're going to maintain defense of the unborn. If you have a bunch of people who are interested in restoring quote unquote abortion rights, and they're the only people who are participating in the local elections, then you're going to get a bunch of local politicians who wish to quote unquote restore abortion rights, right? And they can do that in multiple different ways. As it stands right now, your local state legislature could pass a law that says abortion up to 9 months is fully legal and protected. But on top of that, your representatives can go to DC and hammer out some sort of a abortion protecting bill, or God forbid, an abortion protecting amendment to the Constitution, right? And that would make it nationally illegal to protect the unborn. So if you are interested in making sure that this victory actually is a victory, actually remains something that allows the unborn to be saved, right? Then you need to be voting in your local elections. And you need to be voting for what Doug Wilson has termed smash mouth incrementalism. What does that mean? Well, if you're in the primaries and you have a choice between an abolitionist and a pro-lifer, you go with the abolitionist, right? provided that they don't have some absolutely insane catch, which of course some people do. That it happens. But if you're in that kind of a situation, you go for the person who is more willing to abolish it entirely, right? But then once you get to the general election, you have a choice between a pro-lifer and a pro-choicer. You go with the pro-lifer, obviously, right? And you say, okay, yeah, but this pro-lifer is only only willing to have a ban up to 15 weeks, and he thinks there should be age limits, and he doesn't, he wants carve outs for things like rape, incest, and mental health, and all this other kind of stuff. And it's like he's kind of compromising a lot, and it's like that's 100% right. However, it's that or somebody who's not compromising but is just on the other side entirely. And if you want to avoid that kind of a mix up in the first place, vote in your primaries. That is how you get those people out. Or, creating enough groundswell support for independent and third party candidates that it doesn't actually matter that the Republican nominee is a compromiser. But for the most part, that's not actually how it works. So, again, make sure you're fighting in the primaries to get the genuine conservatives in the party ballot or in the party nomination, right? And then once that's over, readjust, rehuddle, come back and say, all right, we want to make sure the guy who at least believes some of the stuff we do is in, rather than the guy who believes none of the stuff we do, right? And of course, we want to make sure that we're avoiding those situations entirely, but it's not always going to happen. By the way, Ammon Bundy 2022 for governor of Idaho. Speaking to reporters at the White House hang on, I just read that quote. For God's sake, there's an election in November. Vote, 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 vote. End quote, the president said, noting that the justices in the majority practically dares women to assert their political power to put in place laws that restore abortion rights. Quote, consider the challenge accepted, court, but in the meantime, I'm signing this important executive order. End quote. And again, that applies to you also. The blue base is galvanized, so you need to make sure that the red base, is galvanized, that you are active, that you are willing to participate in the coming elections in ways that you may not have been before. Now, the primaries are over for 2022, so you can't be voting in primary elections if you missed out. But the general election's coming in November. If you're here in Idaho, Ammon Bundy, he's on the ballot in November, right? Raul Labrador on the ballot in November. Scott Cleveland on the ballot in November. Vote for these guys, right? And wherever else you happen to be in the country. Look, I wanted in Texas, I really wanted to have somebody like Chad Prather or Alan West as the governor. Both of them lost the nomination. Greg Abbott won the nomination, but it's Greg Abbott or Beto. Go with Abbott, of course, obviously, duh. Right? Don't sit on your hands because, well, Greg Abbott did some stuff I didn't like during the pandemic. Well, you should have done something about that during the primaries. You didn't, and now it's between that guy and Beto, right? Vote, 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 vote. The fight is not over. The fight has literally just begun. Anyways, the order directs, let me go ahead and scroll down here. The order directs Mr. Becerra to develop a report, quote, identifying potential actions, end quote, to protect access to abortion, but does not say what those actions will be. Mr. Becerra will identify steps to ensure that pregnant women have access to emergency care, it says, by, quote, considering updates to current guidance on obligations specific to emergency conditions and stabilizing care, end quote. The order does not specify what those updates will be, but directs Mr. Becerra to report back to Biden in 30 days, which I think we're closer to about 20 days at this point, but I digress on that. Excuse me here. In an effort to prepare for legal challenges from abortion opponents, the order directs the Attorney General and the White House counsel, quote, to convene a meeting of private pro bono attorneys, bar associations, and public interest organizations to encourage robust legal representation. In response to concerns that those seeking abortions could be prosecuted using personal information in emails, text, or web searches, the order seeks to safeguard patient privacy regarding data about women's health services. Now, that's a kind of a straw man, I think. I don't know of any conservatives who wish to access people's private emails, texts, or web searches without warrant. And if you have the warrant, then there's likely already a reason for you to be there. Now, not always, right? Unfortunately, we live in a corrupt country. Sometimes people just give these FISA warrants, as they call them, and you have people watching out for your text and emails and stuff like that without even your knowledge that they're doing so. And I would actually disagree with that, certainly. Privacy does need to be protected. Obviously, privacy to an extent, in the sense that you don't have a right to keep somebody locked in your basement and assault them constantly because it's your basement and it's your private property and that kind of stuff, right? At the same time, though, we don't want to make sure there's state mandated cameras in everybody's state mandated cameras in everybody's basements to ensure that nobody's being beaten in basements, right? That's not something we want. So there's certainly a level of agreement I have with the concern, but where my disagreement then comes in is I don't think any conservatives are actually attempting to get into people's emails and get into people's period tracking apps and stuff like that, right? I just don't think that there's any conservatives who are actually trying to go down that road. If they are, I oppose them. Just like I would oppose the government putting a camera in everybody's basement to make sure you're not beating your children. Obviously, that's not okay, right? But with that being said, I do think it's straw man. I don't think that there's actually a threat to people's period tracking apps or threat to people's emails and stuff like that. Interestingly enough, there is a lot of laws in this country that would allow for such a thing to happen if indeed somebody did want it to happen. Like, so for example, the USA Patriot Act. And I do think we should fight those kinds of things. The USA Patriot Act is an absolutely egregious violation of human liberty. For those of you who don't know, the USA Patriot Act allows people to get secret warrants so that they can wiretap your phones and spy on your emails and text messages. That's actually what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about FISA warrants. That's an egregious violation of liberty. So far, that has not been turned on anybody for things like abortion or anything like that. For the most part, it's used for people who they consider to be terroristic threats, which of course can mean somebody who thinks that a boy is in fact not a girl, according to the state of Virginia, and the Biden administration, actually. But anyways, I digress on that. Anyways, though, I don't want to get too deep into that. The point is, I don't think it's happening. And if it was happening, I would disagree with it, right? But can continue forward. I want to get through this so we can get some of the other stuff. In response to concerns that those seeking abortion could be prosecuted using, and I just read that. It asked the chair of the Federal Trade Commission to consider actions to protect consumer privacy when patients seek information about reproductive care, and it directs Mr. Becerra to consider actions to protect information. And of course, that can get dicey as well, right? Because while you can't have the government tracking people's text messages, you also can't mandate that certain individuals hide crimes, right? So, for example, if a child were to go to the hospital because they had a broken arm, and the child revealed to the doctor or the nurse or somebody at the hospital that their father had actually broken their arm in a fit of drunken rage, well, you can't pass a law that says that doctor has to respect the privacy of this family and therefore cannot report the crime to the higher ups. In fact, the exact opposite is true, right? The child has revealed that a crime has been done unto them, that there is a threat to them and their the threat to their life, really. But there's a word I'm looking for that is fleeting my mind at the moment. And you actually have a moral obligation to report that, right? And I think the same thing is true in the case of these, of abortion. If you have somebody who goes to a doctor's office and, over the course of their visit, it is revealed that they've had an abortion, I don't think you can pass a law that says that doctor is somehow held to secrecy to protect the agents or to protect the patient's privacy. I just don't think that I don't think that works, right? Um, it's a dicey situation, but I think that that's overstepping the boundaries of a right to privacy, and I think that example I gave with the child being abused is a perfect example as to why. But anyway, the order pledges that the administration will ensure safety of patients, providers, and third parties who are delivering or receiving abortion services, but it does not say how agencies will ensure that amid heightened tensions after the Supreme Court decision. Mr. Biden has repeatedly said that, President Biden, it annoys me when articles do that. He has the title, call him by his title. President Biden has repeatedly said that he does not have the authority to restore the constitutional right to abortion that the court ended when it overturned Roe. Now, two things. Number one, that's true. So golf claps for Biden. Good job. Every dead clock is right twice a day, I guess. But secondly, you can't restore something that doesn't exist. There is no constitutional right to abortion. I challenge anybody on the entire planet to show me in the Constitution where it says the right to abort your fetus shall not be infringed. You can search all day. In fact, I'll even let you search not only that, but the Articles of Confederation, Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, John Adams' personal writings, Thomas Jefferson's personal writings, George Washington's personal writings. We can go through all the different founding fathers and framers' writings from the 1700s, and I guarantee you, not a single one of them said even a word about a constitutional right to abortion. Guarantee it. Guarantee it. As a matter of fact, I'll make a challenge to you guys. If you can find me where they did, I'll Venmo you $20. Not kidding. Show me the evidence. I will Venmo you $20. Anyways, in the hours after the ruling, the president said he was powerless to restore the status quo, and of course that is true. Quote, the only way we can secure a woman's right to choose and the balance that existed is for Congress to restore the protections of Roe v. Wade as a federal law. Mr. Biden said no executive order from the president can do that, end quote, which is, again, exactly true, which is why you guys need to be active in politics. There is a deadly disease amongst evangelicals thinking like, oh, well, I'm just not going to vote because it doesn't matter anyway. Bull. Bogus. Balagna. It's nonsense, friends. It does matter. Okay? The way that we got into the situation we're in now is by a bunch of people getting together and saying it didn't matter. And so they didn't vote. And so they didn't go and take their primary seriously. And so they didn't make sure they were putting forward very solid candidates. They didn't have any sort of activism or anything like that. And now we're in America 2022, right? You need to be active in these things. I'm not saying you need to be out, patrolling the streets, talking about vote for such and such a candidate, but at least participate in the elections. If you have a candidate who you think is legitimate, tell people about it. Give him $5 for the campaign, right? Participate in the discussion in the electoral process. That is the only way that victory will be had here. And I was going to say barring divine intervention, but to be honest with you, that would be divine intervention. What do I mean by that? Well, our country is so lost at this point that naturalistic mechanisms on their own are not going to save it, right? So if we indeed get enough conservatives galvanized that we actually do have the rule of law restored, right? That would absolutely, positively, beyond any shadow of a doubt, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, be divine grace. Right now, as it stands, there is no hope for this country whatsoever. And you run-of-the-mill conservatives without the divine grace of God are not going to save the country, right? But that galvanization, in my opinion, would be some evidence, would be some fruit that indeed the Holy Spirit is still working in this country. on a national level, because of course he works on a personal level all the time. Other administration officials have also said that the president's hands are largely tied, in part because of the Hyde Amendment, a provision in federal law precluding the government from paying for abortions except in cases of rape or incest, or to save the life of the mother. To be clear, specifically the federal government, people still do use state taxes for abortions all the time, but yeah, just want to clarify that real quick. Mr. Becerra said his agency will work with the Justice Department to ensure that women have access to abortion pills, drugs taken 24 to 28 hours apart, and authorized, for use during the first weeks of pregnancy. In places where state laws conflict with the judgment of the Food and Drug Administration, which approved the drugs for use and determined that they are safe and effective. Beyond that, President Biden and Secretary Becerra, I hate that so much. Just call them by their titles, guys. Why is that a thing that we don't do anymore in journalism? Like, that is so annoying. Anyways, have said that Americans should vote for lawmakers who support abortion rights so that Congress can take action to establish federal protections for access. The attempt to shift responsibility has not gone. It's not shifting responsibility. The article writer just doesn't know what he's talking about. But I digress. The attempt to shift responsibility has not gone over well among some of President Biden's core supporters, who have repeatedly called on the White House to push to find novel ways around the court's decision and the subsequent limits on abortion that the ruling automatically imposed in more than a dozen states with Republican-led legislatures and Republican governors. Some activists and lawmakers, for example, have urged the president to establish abortion services on federal land or on Native American territories, where state laws and abortion services might not be enforceable. The White House has dismissed those ideas as legally unworkable and potentially more dangerous for women seeking abortions. Also, this is my little addition here, I would argue that the state has the right to actually forcibly remove any federal government officials who would do such a thing, right? And I would, in fact, if I was governor, say here of Idaho, if I was governor of Idaho, and there was a law passed that said abortion laws are not valid on federal land, I would quite simply send the police to that federal agency and arrest them and put them in prison. We'd charge them aiding and abetting murder, and we'd send them in there, and the federal government can kick rocks, frankly. They violated the law within the borders of our state. I don't give a damn if you think that it's federal land. It's my state. That's just the way it's going to work. And that's the way states really should be operating when it comes to this kind of stuff, right? And this is part of what I was saying earlier as far as, what should we think about these executive orders or about a potential law that passes, that passes through the Congress, right? Well, we should ignore them. We should ignore them. It's not like people haven't ignored them before, right? I mean, think about the pot laws. I always bring this up. Think about the pot laws in California and in Alaska and in Washington and in Colorado. You realize that the federal government says that marijuana is illegal, right? Not was illegal, is illegal currently, as of this point in time, July 13th, 2022. And yet those states said, you know what? We don't really care. We're going to do whatever we want to do. Why don't conservative states do the same in regards to abortion? I know why. It's because our leaders are cowards. But rhetorically speaking, humor me. Why don't we do this? We absolutely, positively could do this. And it's been done before. Greg Abbott, I can't remember what exactly the context was. I think it was the IRS wanting to collect some taxation that the governor thought was illegitimate or something like that. But he literally had the National Guard sit there around federal land and say, jump, I dare you. Get froggy, please. Let's do this, right? It's actually one of my favorite things Greg Abbott has ever done, or any governor for that matter. That's exactly the way that it should be. And I understand why people would be worried about that kind of thing. The state literally telling the federal government to kick rocks, right? I mean, it has the potential to get bad. I get that. But you know what else is bad? Is 900,000 babies slaughtered every year, right? And there is absolutely no excuse for us to just sit here and say, oh, well, the federal government said it was okay, so. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I see Kelby saying that it's my my stuff is lagging here and then speeding up to catch up with itself. I hope that doesn't actually continue after we're live. In other words, I hope the video itself has normal quality after the fact. But by the way, thank you, Kelby. I appreciate you. Also ready to secede from the earth. Anyways, let's get through this. There's at least one more article I want to get to, and then we're done. On Thursday, a reporter asked Karine Jean-Pierre, whatever that is. I think that's Pierre. I can't read. Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, whether the president was examining the possibility that the Department of Veterans Affairs could offer abortion services at VA hospitals. Think about that for a moment. I just want to point out. Oh my goodness. We won't actually take care of our veterans at veteran hospitals, but we will suggest potentially murdering our babies at veteran hospitals because that's just how disgusting the left actually is. Moving on. Quote, as you know, current regulation doesn't allow for the VA to provide abortions, Ms. Jean-Pierre said. Quote, we're going to continue to review. We're going to continue to explore every possible option to protect women's so-called rights and access to reproduction health, end quote. I, of course, added the so-called. Opponents, of abortion rights. I hate the word like that. It's not a right. We'll say, how about advocates for the unborn? I like that. How about opponents of legalized infanticide? That seems to ring very nicely. Abortion rights, yeah, those aren't a thing, so I can't oppose them. Anyways, criticized the president's order on Friday. Gene F. Mancini, the president of March for Life, called it, quote, tragic that this administration is using the power to push for more and more painful abortions, which harm women and take innocent lives, end quote. She added, quote, our nation today faces significant challenges. Not enough abortion is not one of them, end quote, which, of course, is absolutely the fact. Some abortion rights advocates praised the president for signing the order. I'm going to totally pronounce this wrong, sorry. Timaraju. Man, it's terrible. Minnie Timaraju, the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, said in a statement that, quote, President Biden's executive order to safeguard access to reproductive health care, including abortion care, is an important first step in restoring the rights taken from millions of Americans by the Supreme Court, end quote. Other advocates urged President Biden to step in and take bolder action, even if he risks being overturned in court. They want him to declare a public health emergency, a move that would not only enable the administration to move quickly to expand access to abortion, including by ensuring that abortion pills can be prescribed in states where abortion is legal. Quote, you need to be willing to take some risks, even if the anticipation is it might not work, end quote, said Hunter Miller, the president of the National Institute for Reproductive Health and Advocacy organization. Quote, because we are facing an immediate crisis, end quote. How detestable can these people be? It's a crisis that I can't rip my baby into shreds. A crisis. And again, this is why our states we need to have leaders in our states which just say, sorry, I'm just not going to play along. Not interested. You can pass as many laws as you like. We're going to do things the way we do things here, and you're going to suck it up. You can deal with it. I don't really care. I mean, what are you going to do? Invade us? All right, fine. Well, if that's where this is going to go, America's probably on the brink of a civil war anyways. It might as well be over the right of the unborn. But likely that's not going to happen anyways, right? These states want to declare a medical emergency, then we could just undeclare a medical emergency. See how simple that was? You said there was an emergency, you said there was a crisis, and I said that there wasn't. So I guess we're at an impasse. Well, not really an impasse. We're at a you losing kind of situation because you're not going to enforce those within the confines of my state. By the way, that's one of the reasons I keep saying Ammon Monday 2022, because for those of you who are in Idaho, Brad Little is not the kind of guy who's going to stick up to the federal government and say, sorry, but no mas. Ammon is. And whatever state you're in, you should be voting for people to do something similar. Until Friday, officials had been coy about how far Biden was willing to go. Asked on Thursday about a possible executive order related to abortion, Ms. Jean-Pierre declined to answer the question, saying she would not get ahead of the president. President Biden signed the executive order on Friday before leaving for a weekend at his beach house in Delaware. The fact sheet did not include any of the more far-reaching suggestions about using federal resources excuse me, to provide abortion services. And we end the article there. It took me 45 minutes to get that. Just call rape surprise sex. That's funny. Um, Interestingly enough, I do believe that if you press pro-choicers on why rape is wrong, they will effectively end up concluding abortion is wrong. What I mean by that is, if I had the absolute right to bodily autonomy, well, it's my penis, my choice, right? I should be able to put it wherever I want. The response to that from rational and sane people is, yeah, you do have the right to bodily autonomy, but that ends when you start violating somebody else's bodily autonomy. And it's like, oh, really? That's interesting. That's almost like the argument against abortion. Thank you. Golf claps for you. Anyways, um, with that being said, I want to talk very briefly now about, in the remaining time that I have, about Canada's C11 and what it is. We have a lot of people, not a lot, because we don't have a lot of people who watch this in general, but there's more than a couple people who watch this program who are in Canada. They are our brothers in Adam. They're our brother Americans in the sense of being North Americans, and they're going through a lot, I think. They're going through a lot worse than some of us here in the States are, because, in certain areas in the United States, things are basically normal, right? Obviously we have states like California and New York and Florida and stuff like that where things have gotten hectic. And there's a little bit of bleed into everything. For example, Boise just had a pride rally that was just basically a pornography rally this last June, right? That didn't used to happen 6 years ago. But for the most part, things are relatively normal in middle America. In Canada, that is not true. Anywhere in Canada. The far-reaching implications of the Trudeau state, or the far-reaching arm of the Trudeau state, is in everybody's pockets, right? And I want to talk a little bit about that here today. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the next episode also. But this is from a Government of Canada website. An act to enact the Consumer Privacy Protection Act and the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act, and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts. This is talking about Bill C11. What is it, and why should we care? Let's go ahead and read. Explanatory note, Section 4.2 of the Department of Justice Act requires the Minister of Justice to prepare a charter statement for every government bill to help inform public and parliamentary debate on government bills. One of the Minister of Justice's most important responsibilities is to examine legislation for inconsistency with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or the Charter. By tabling a charter statement, the minister is sharing some of the key considerations that informed the review of a bill for inconsistency within the charter. I just realized I'm not actually sharing the screen. So let me go ahead and do that. All right. By tabling a charter statement, the minister is sharing some of the key considerations that inform the review of a bill for inconsistency within the charter. A statement identifies charter rights and freedoms that may potentially be engaged by a bill and provides a brief explanation of the nature of any engagement in light of the measures being proposed. A charter statement also identifies potential justifications for any limits a bill may impose on charter rights and freedoms. Section 1 of the charter provides that rights and freedoms may be subject to reasonable limits if those limits are prescribed by law and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. This is where the importance is going to come in, and it'll come up again as we continue reading, but I'll read one more time. Section 1 of the charter provides that rights and freedoms may be subject to reasonable limits. Notice rights and freedoms. So in other words, things which are legitimately your right and legitimately your freedom may be subject to reasonable limits if those limits are prescribed by law and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And of course, who gets to determine whether or not they're justified? The Canadian government gets to determine that. This means that Parliament may enact laws that limit charter rights and freedoms. Again, This means that Parliament may enact laws that limit charter rights and freedoms. One more time. This means that the Canadian Parliament may enact laws that limit Canadians' charter rights and freedoms. We have a lot of friends up there in Canada. And in fact, for those of you who watch both my channels, you'll know our good friend Donnie over at Standing for Truth. He's in Canada. Cryptomaria, one of our #1 fans here, she is in Canada. Jordan Peterson, who is somebody who a lot of people get, philosophical information from and stuff like that. He's up there in Canada. Stephen Crowder's a Canadian. I have family up there in Canada. In fact, that's my grandfather is a first-generation immigrant from Canada. It's weird to think of it that way because Canada is so similar to us. But the point is, this is just right across the border. This is our friends. This is our family. This is our brothers and sisters in Adam and in Christ. And it's getting bad up there. This is only one example of it getting bad up there, but believe me, it is getting very bad up there. Trudeau is an evil, evil dude. And when I say evil, I want to be clear. I don't think Trudeau is stupid. I don't think Trudeau is incompetent. I think Trudeau is the kind of person who would starve Ukraine if he thought Ukrainian nationalism was getting too extreme. For those of you who don't know, that's a reference to Joseph Stalin and the Holodomor. I absolutely believe that Trudeau is that kind of person, and I've been saying it for quite some time. The charter will be violated only where a limit is not demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. A charter statement is intended to provide legal information to the public and Parliament on a bill's potential effects and rights and freedoms that are neither trivial nor too speculative. It is not intended to be a comprehensive overview of all conceivable charter considerations. Additional considerations relevant to the constitutionality of a bill may also arise in the House, or in the course, of parliamentary study and amendment of a bill. A statement is not a legal opinion on the constitutionality of a bill. Continuing. Charter considerations. The Minister of Justice has examined Bill C-11 to enact the Consumer Privacy Protection Act and the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act, and to make it related and consequential amendment, and to make related, and consequential amendments to other acts, which is the name of the bill, for any inconsistency with the Charter pursuant to its obligation under Section 4.1 of the Department of Justice Act. This review involves consideration of the objectives and features of the bill. What follows is a non-exhaustive, discussion of the ways in which Bill C-11 potentially engages the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Charter. It is presented to assist in informing the public and parliamentary debate on this bill. Overview. Bill C-11, also known as the Digital Charter Implementation Act 2020, would repeal parts of the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Acts and replace them with a new legislative regime governing the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information for commercial activity in Canada. I'll read that one more time. Would repeal parts of the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act and replace them with a new legislative regime, so a parliamentary body, which governed the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information for commercial activity in Canada. And if that sounds like something that came out of a 1984 novel, it's because it practically did. This is quite literally saying that they want a parliamentary bureaucracy to actually sit there and govern not just the collection, but also use and disclosure of people's personal information for commercial activity. So whenever you sign on to, just for example, Facebook, and Facebook asks for some personal information, right? Well, they would like there to be, in Canada at least, they would like there to be a parliamentary body that actually governs the use of that information. Continuing, because it gets worse. As the core of this regime, the Consumer Privacy Protection Act would be enacted to maintain, modernize, and extend existing rules and to impose new rules on private sector organizations for the protection of personal information. You guys remember everything that happened there with the truckers, right? Certain people had their assets liquidated by the state because they had supported the trucker convoy. Well, laws like this not only are how you get that kind of thing done, but are how they will continue to do so, and more harshly, in the future. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act would also continue and enhance the role of the Privacy Commissioner in overseeing organizations' compliance with these measures. The Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act would be enacted to create a tribunal to hear appeals of orders issued by the Privacy Commissioner and apply a new administrative monetary penalty regime created under the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. Provisions of the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act governing electronic alternatives to paper records would be retained under the new title of the Electronic Documents Act. Continuing. Oh, I just noticed that it switched over my entire screen. I thought I had just the tab shared, but I wanted to quickly look at my time. Anyways, I guess I have my whole screen shared, not just a tab. That's fine. Government access to organizations' information. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act would reenact and add to the Privacy Commissioner's existing investigation and audit powers and extend them to the Privacy Commissioner's new authority to conduct inquiries into alleged violations of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. These powers include the authority to compel the production of records and enter private places other than dwelling houses, to examine records and converse with individuals in the place entered. Again, these powers include the authority to compel the production of records and enter private places other than dwelling houses, to examine records and converse with individuals in the places entered. Are you guys understanding that? These powers would include the authority of these state officials to enter into private areas warrantless so that they may examine monetary records and ensure that the populace is keeping in line with what the government says you can do with your money, digitally speaking. The Privacy Commissioner would be allowed to share information with certain other federal regulatory bodies if certain conditions are met. The Privacy Commissioner would keep the authority to share information with provincial counterparts and foreign states, The Privacy Commissioner would keep the authority to share information with Communist China, is what that is saying. With Putin's Russia, with Saudi Arabia, with anyone else who they decide they want to share their information with. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act would also reenact a range of provisions in the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act that allow organizations to disclose an individual's personal information to a government institution without their knowledge or consent in certain circumstances. Again, the act would allow organizations to disclose an individual's personal information to a government institution without their knowledge or consent in certain circumstances. In addition, it would reenact related provisions allowing an organization to collect personal information for the purposes of some of these disclosures. So you can also collect somebody's personal information without that person's knowledge or consent, and then you can share that personal information with other government powers and indeed with other foreign states without that person's permission or even knowledge. Existing rules that may limit the information an organization is allowed to provide to an individual about these disclosures would remain. Next section, search and seizure. Section 8 of the Charter protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The purpose of Section 8 is to protect individuals from an unreasonable intrusion into a reasonable expectation of privacy by the state. A search or seizure will be reasonable if it is authorized by law. The law itself is reasonable in the sense of striking an appropriate balance between privacy interest and the state interest being advanced, and the search is carried out in a reasonable manner. Interestingly enough, a search or seizure will be reasonable if it is authorized by law, is basically saying if we say it's reasonable, then it's reasonable. Anyways, the following considerations support the consistency of the Privacy Commissioner's support. One more time. The following considerations support the consistency of the Privacy Commissioner's investigative inquiry and audit powers within Section 8. Organizations will not necessarily enjoy a reasonable expectation of privacy in relation to information subject to these regulatory investigations, inquiries, and audit powers. Notice again, organizations will not necessarily enjoy a reasonable expectation of privacy in relation to information subject to these regulatory investigation, inquiry, and audit powers. Where they do, the Privacy Commissioner's legal authority to access and share the information would be clearly set out in the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. This legal authority would support the objectives of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act through tailored powers that would be similar to those found in other regulatory contexts and would be subject to restrictions governing their issue. In the case of reenacted provisions allowing organizations to disclose personal information to a government institution in certain circumstances, consistency within Section 8 is supported by the following considerations. The focus of with Section 8, not within, with Section 8. The focus of the measures is on ensuring the Consumer Privacy Protection Act is not a barrier to disclosure where a disclosure is authorized by another source of legal authority, like another law, a warrant, or subpoena, or where a disclosure is voluntarily and at the initiative of a private sector organization. A broad range of transparency, accountability, and oversight provisions exist under other measures and the broader legal context governing public institutions to limit impacts on privacy interests. The limits on information that an organization is allowed to provide to an individual about disclosures to government institutions are tailored to allow information to be shared with the individual when it would not compromise sensitive government operations. Similar considerations support consistency with Section 8 in relation to provisions permitting the collection of personal information without an individual's knowledge or consent for the purposes of specific disclosure to government institutions. Notice, for the purposes of specific disclosures to government institutions. So you're, again, collecting this data without the consent or knowledge of the person whose data it is, specifically so you can share it with other government institutions. These collection provisions, enable organizations to respond to government requests for information where the disclosure to government is authorized by another source of legal authority, like another law, a warrant, or a subpoena. They also support voluntary disclosures at the initiative of private sector organizations. These voluntary disclosures of personal information without the consent or knowledge of the individual are permitted only in limited situations. These include where the organization suspects the information relates to specifically listed matters of significant public importance, such as national security. Again, think the trucker convoy. Potential limits on commercial expression and openness in new adjudicative processes. Restrictions on the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information in the Consumer Privacy Protection Act could impact regulated entities' expressive activities where these activities would involve a collection, use, or disclosure of personal information that is restricted or prohibited under the Act. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act would also maintain the Privacy Commissioner's general obligation of confidentiality with some exceptions, including an ability to make information public when the Commissioner considers that it is in the public interest to do so. So you can now take the information, this is what this is saying. I want you to be able to take the information without my knowledge or consent, provided that I'm the hypothetical Canadian here, share it with other government bodies, and then make it public, which is doxing, by the way, without me ever even knowing that you had collected the information in the first place. While the adjudicative functions of the tribunal under the Personal Information and Data, under the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act would be public by default, there are exceptions allowing for the protection of confidential information and holding proceedings in private. In addition, unless the complainant consents, the tribunal would be required not to disclose the complainant's name or identifying information and would have discretion with respect to naming organizations in its decision. Freedom of expression, Section 2B of the Charter. Section 2B of the Charter protects freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including the open court principle. Under this principle, there is a presumption that court and tribunal proceedings are open to both the public and the media. Section 2B can also protect commercial expression. The following considerations support the consistency with the Charter provision that would limit the openness of adjudicative processes and the disclosure of related information. Both the Privacy Commissioner under the tribunal would retain discretion over the openness of their respective proceedings. This discretion must be exercised in accordance with the Charter, which must be exercised in accordance with the Charter, allows a proper balance to be struck between openness and any competing considerations such as privacy. This is a presumption that tribunal proceedings will be open, or there is, a presumption that tribunal proceedings will be open. To the extent the Consumer Privacy Protection Act would interfere with protected commercial expression, consistency with the Charter is supported by the following considerations. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act applies only to personal information and advances an important regulatory purpose. It balances individuals' interest in the protection of their personal information with organizations' needs. It is consent-based and recognizes a range of other circumstances in which personal information may be legitimately used for commercial processes. The provision of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act may be viewed as proportionate to the objectives of supporting and promoting commerce through the protection of personal information. We're almost done. Enforcement regime. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act would authorize the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal to impose an administrative monetary penalty on an organization which has contravened the Act. It would also create new offenses for re-identifying personal information that has been de-identified, subject to an exception, for security testing, and contravening an order issued by the Privacy Commissioner following the inquiry. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act would keep offenses for when organizations knowingly contravene specific obligations that they have under the Act. The offense of obstructing the investigation of a complaint or the conduct of an audit would extend to the Commissioner's new inquiry function. These offenses would be punishable by fine. Last section, offense rights. Section 11 of the Charter. Section 11 of the Charter guarantees certain rights to persons who have been charged with an offense, including the right to a fair and public hearing before an independent and impartial adjudicator. Its protections apply only to persons charged with an offense, which is one of the ways they're going to be able to get around this, right? If they haven't charged you with anything, then you aren't actually protected. For the purposes of Section 11, this occurs when a person is subject either to proceedings that are criminal in nature or that result in true penal consequences. True penal consequences include imprisonment and fines with a punitive purpose or effect, such as when a fine or penalty is out of proportion to the amount required to achieve regulatory purposes. The following considerations support the consistency of the administrative monetary penalty and offense provisions with Section 11. The proposed administrative monetary penalty provisions would not involve criminal charges, prosecution, or sentencing. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act would expressly provide that their purpose is to promote compliance with the legislative regime, not to punish. So, oh my goodness, that's such a word salad, it's not even funny. Would expressly provide that their purpose is to promote compliance with the legislative regime, not to punish. So we're giving you these fines and penalties and things of that nature so that you comply with Parliament, not to punish you for not complying with Parliament. You follow? Yeah, me neither. Administrative monetary penalties would be subject to a legislated cap with no mandatory minimum fine. The Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal would have discretion to impose administrative monetary penalties. The exercise of this discretion would be governed by statutory criteria. While not punishable by imprisonment, the proposed offense provision would provide for criminal charges, prosecution, and sentencing that would engage rights under Section 11 of the Charter. In reviewing the relevant measures, no potential inconsistencies between the offense provision and rights under Section 11 have been identified. And of course, this is the state saying that the state is not violating the law by passing a law, which is just absolutely hilarious. I always love it when government officials declare that government officials have not actually violated the law, right? Or when members of a regime say, no, members of the regime have not actually violated the law. It's like, that's exactly what I expect from you. I don't understand why you would expect anything different. At any rate, though, we're going to talk more about this in the coming weeks. I've been made aware of this by a longtime fan, Cryptomaria, and I am going to continue to report on it, because I think it's a really, really big problem. To be honest with you, Canada is on the brink of becoming a very serious dictatorship. And in very serious ways we are too. Kelvin Coelho says, we're not tyrants, bro. We're just encouraging you to obey. Exactly. It's like, that is such a word salad. I don't even know what to do with it. But unfortunately, our brothers and sisters up there in Canada are going to have to deal with this kind of stuff. And so we are going to continue um, to keep reporting on it. We're going to continue to give you guys more details about C11. I want to thank Cryptomaria for sharing this information with me, and my prayers definitely go out to you and to your nation. Um, I think that Canadian patriots absolutely need to make themselves known here, and we as American patriots, I think, there is there's a level of, as we love liberty and as we love our Christian society that the West has produced, there is a level in which we should be, fighting with them. Obviously, not the same. We're not Canadians, right? Um, we're not going to vote in their elections, for example, right? But I think it is important for us to know this information. I think it's important for us to stand with them on this information, or as it pertains to this information. And yeah, just just remember we'll be talking about this more in the future. Anyways, Brother Neil was also one who joined us here in the live chat. So thank you for being here. Um, let's see. There was one question I had, and absolutely says I'm going to call my boy in Montreal about this. Absolutely do so. We know a lot of Canadians, all of us, right? Whether that, I mean, my boss is Canadian. My great uncles and aunts are all Canadian. My very good friend Donnie is Canadian. Good friend of this channel, Cryptomaria, is Canadian. Um, that it's right across the border. They speak the same language. They have virtually the same culture. We're kind of tied at the hip in a way. Not in the way that like globalists talk about, but certainly in a way, right? In a very serious way. And so I think we need to be standing with them. But there was one question here because I told you guys about answering questions. I saw one, and that is this one from Richard Neal. SCOTUS can deliver a verdict that certain legislation is unconstitutional, but can they reverse executive orders? Repeat the question one more time. SCOTUS can deliver a verdict that certain legislation is unconstitutional, but can they reverse executive orders? It's a great question. The answer is yes. SCOTUS can reverse an executive order in the case that it is unconstitutional. In fact, they have done so before. And in fact, it doesn't even necessarily need to be SCOTUS itself. It can be any of the courts. In fact, Donald Trump ran into a lot of problems with federal courts, circuit courts in particular. Um, and that as a result, a lot of the stuff he wanted to get passed, like the so-called Muslim ban, which wasn't actually a Muslim ban, it was a ban on immigration from certain countries, or when he was going after DACA, right? A lot of times they didn't even actually make it to the Supreme Court. They were just shot down by circuit courts. But those are just examples of it happening recently. But the answer is yes. SCOTUS can actually nullify a executive order provided that they have reason to believe the executive order is unconstitutional. Excuse me. I personally think the concept of executive orders has become unconstitutional. There is constitutional provision for executive orders. I want to be clear, but the way we use them in the modern day is just absurd. But yes, the answer is yes. And if you want to see an example of that, there's a number of executive orders that Donald Trump had passed that did not actually make it through the courts, such as his so-called Muslim ban and his wanting to repeal of DACA, otherwise known as the Dreamers Act. I think that was the only question that we received from you guys. There is one comment that I did want to address, which was from our brother Kevin, who asked, "What if our votes don't matter?" But he didn't actually tag me. Um, I I got to be honest. I think that people are naive when they say your vote doesn't count. I mean, not with respect, brother Kevin, but um, you know, even in the election that we just had recently, which I think was rigged, there was still, a lot um, of back and forth that was legitimately happening, right? Um, and the thing about it too is, when you're talking about the general election, you only have to cheat in a couple pinch points in order to have it in effect. But when you're talking about elections on the state level, which includes your senatorial elections, by the way, that's a lot harder to do because the popular vote is how that's actually established, um, at least in most of the states, right? And so basically, if 51% of Idahoans vote for Ammon Bundy, he's the governor. It's that simple, right? You can't just pinch point certain places and say, oh, well, they won the electoral votes here, therefore. And all the places you could even try some funny business like Boise and Coeur d'Alene, well, they're already thoroughly blue, so you're not doing anything, right? On top of that, because of 2020, a lot of states did pass protections to try and make sure that there is no cheating in future elections. But yeah, so those are my answers to that. Appreciate you guys who are here or who were here or who will be here in the future. Any of you guys, appreciate all of you. If you like this, please consider liking and sharing this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. If you actually appreciate this news content, if you think this is one of the better news contents out there, then please consider helping me make this into a full-time career. I'm trying to do the journalism, philosophy, history, and apologetics thing all at once, right? But nonetheless, you can do that either by giving to the Patreon. Patreon, of course, is going to be subscription-based service. I don't have tiers. You can give as much or as little as you like. And I appreciate anybody who gives me that vote of confidence by way of their dollar. There are hundreds of thousands of voices in the world. And so you sitting here and saying, I think your voice is one that needs to be heard, and I'm going to make sure to pay to make that happen, it really goes a long way, and I appreciate it tremendously. If you want to contribute, but you don't want to contribute monthly, you can also do that by way of my PayPal. Again, don't have any tiers. You can give as much or as little as you like. Also, consider liking us on Gab, Parler, Minds, Twitter, and Facebook. You can find me at the Synagogue. And make sure to look up the Synagogue on Rumble so that you get notified of the videos that are on there. Sometimes videos will be taken down here. And when they are taken down here, that's where you're going to have to find them. And also, if we ever get banned entirely, that's just where you're going to have to find this show in general. Links to all of the aforementioned, well, not all, I guess not the social media accounts, but links to the Rumble, the Patreon, and the PayPal are in the live chat. We're going to go ahead and get out of here, friends. Questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything like that in the comment section below. I want to remind you guys to be watchdogs. I want to ask you guys the question: in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise